very well received. Last Sunday evening, we began a study of Judas the Apostle, and we drew about 5 or 6 lessons from the life of Judas, and tonight we're going to continue that in making some applications. And in looking over some material and preparing that lesson last week, it developed from 1 lesson into 2 as I began thinking about the applications, and now I think it has grown into 3, because this is going to be 2 parts of the applications that we're going to make, because I've come up with a list of 7 applications, 7 truths that we can learn about sin, 7 things about from the life of Judas, 7 things that we can reflect on. And rather than just rushing all through 7 of those in 1 lesson, I think we'll split them up and do 4 this evening, and Lord willing, next Sunday evening we'll do the final 3. And so we're going to be thinking about truths that we can learn, sad truths that we can learn about sin based on the life of Judas. And we have spent adequate amount of time, I think, last Sunday evening discussing his sin and the consequences of it and the implications of that. And so we want to begin in making applications. The first 2 of these applications that I'm going to give you actually come from a commentary by William Barclay. William Barclay has written commentaries on every book of the New Testament. He is not a member of the New Testament church, but had a great deal of keen insight into many things in the Scriptures. And the first 2 of these are actually based on some things that he wrote in his commentary on Matthew. And then following that, just from a variety of other sources and my own study contributing the remaining ones. We're going to look at 4 of those tonight. Number one, here is sad truth, if you want to say it that way, sad truth. Number 1 about sin, based on the life of Judas, and we're making application of what he did. Number 1, and I'm going to read this. This is almost ironic because of what happened at 2 a.m. this morning. But I'm going to read this exactly the way Mr. Barclay wrote it. He says, "The terrible thing about sin is that we cannot put the clock back." Well, actually we did. And we did set the clock back at 2 a.m. this morning or sometime prior to that. And we do understand, though, in regard, on a much more serious level, in regard to sin, that the terrible thing is what? We cannot set the clock back. We cannot put the clock back. As I have said on a couple of other occasions, and I think it reflects probably the feeling and wish of every one of us in here, if you could give me a time machine and I could go back, just let me pick 5 times. And if I could get in a time machine and I could use it 5 times, I would probably in fact I know I would have a very hard time deciding which 5 times to pick. But I'm not going back to celebrate some grand occasion. I'm not going back to watch some grand event. I'm not going back even to be with loved ones that have passed on that I would like to see again. I'm going back to change some of my mistakes. That's why I would go back. If I could turn the clock back. The sad thing about it is, not only can we not turn the clock back a year or 2 or a decade, we can't even turn it back 1 minute. And once those words we should not have said pass our lips, once that action that we should not have engaged in is engaged in, we have already crossed the line. And we cannot turn back the clock. I think perhaps with the compounding weight of the guilt of what Judas had done, as we read about the decisions he made following this, the eventual even taking of his own life, that he probably desperately wished he could have turned the clock back. And sometimes we enter into sins different ways. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 says, if any man be overtaken in a fault. let those who are spiritual restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness or meekness. The idea seems to be in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, that we can be overtaken by sin. We're not necessarily looking for sin. We're not planning to sin. But maybe seemingly out of the blue, temptation arises and we're overtaken and we sin. And then there's another kind of sin. That's the kind of sin that Romans 13, verse 14 talks about. It's the last verse in Romans chapter 13. It says that we should not make provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. In other words, there are some times when I am not overtaken in a sin, but I have kind of orchestrated my life in a series of events so that sin will just be available. I make provision for the flesh. I chart it out. I plan it out. And regardless of whether we are overtaken in sin and we didn't intend to do that, we didn't mean to do that, that was not our plan from the beginning, or we did plan to do it, we've made provision for the flesh, regardless, both of those scenarios, we can't turn the clock back. We can't undo the things that we have done. And when you look at Judas' life, you are particularly impressed by the fact, or not impressed in the way that, wow, isn't that great, but it is impressed upon us, it is stressed to us that Judas' sin maybe was not just done in a moment of passion. This is something he chose to do. And he didn't just do this off the cuff. In fact, Matthew chapter 26, after he's made the deal with the chief priest to betray Jesus, Matthew chapter 26, verse 16 says he's, from that point forward, look at it, depending on what translation you have, he sought opportunity to betray him. This was not something that Judas did as a fit of passion or just in a moment's time that we all are subject to occasionally and that we regret later. This is something that Judas sought opportunity to make this happen. He was putting the mechanisms in place so that the wheels would roll and it would bring him to the desired result of the sin that he had planned. Yes, he was making provision for the flesh in one way, but he was making provision for the betrayal of the life of our Lord. And no doubt, when we see his reaction to that, when we see the regret that he did have, the sorrow that he did have, I'm quite sure Judas would have wished for a time machine, for an opportunity to undo what he had done. But you cannot turn the clock back when you've gone this far, when you have deliberately planned and then fulfilled your plans of sin. And that is a very sad truth about sin. Sad truth number 2. Again, this initial idea comes from Mr. Barclay, but we want to elaborate on it a little more than he does in just a couple of sentences in his commentary on Matthew. But Mr. Barclay says, the strange thing about sin is that a man can come to hate the very thing he gained by it. The strange thing about sin is that a man can come to hate the very thing that he gained by it. What did Judas gain from the sin? Well, 30 pieces of silver. He gained money. And we already know from other things that are said about Judas that he was greedy and selfish and had a great deal of covetousness in his heart. Money was what he wanted. He was stealing, pilfering, absconding, embezzling from the common treasury of Jesus and his disciples. And so money was what he wanted. And overall, the amount that he agreed for and bargained for was somewhat of a small sum, but he wanted it, and they gave it to him. And then when he comes to realize the implications of all that he had done and of all his sin, he takes that money, he goes back to the chief priest, he goes back to the temple, and what does he do? He throws it down and gets rid of it. He says, I don't want this anymore. I don't care to have this anymore. The very thing that he wanted, the very thing that his primary sin was involved in, stealing, taking money. We'll say a little more about this even in part 2 of this lesson of Sad Truths about sin next Sunday night, Lord willing. But this whole idea that the very thing that Judas wanted became so very detestable and despicable to him, he could not get rid of it fast enough. In fact, the text says that he took it to the temple and that he flung it down, that he threw it down, because he was so wanting to separate himself from what he had. The devil works that way. He entices us and makes us think that this is what you want. This is what would bring you pleasure. This is the answer to all your problems. He deceives us into thinking that. He deceives us into believing that. And then once we take it, we bite into it, it becomes detestable and despicable. And we would like to do nothing better than get rid of it and to get it as far away from ourselves as we possibly can. You may recall the story of one of David's sons named Amnon in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And in 1 Samuel chapter 13, Amnon has a very passionate desire for one of his half-sisters, a woman named Tamar. And he is lusting after her, and he wants to be involved with her physically and sexually. He sets up a scenario in 1 Samuel chapter 13 where this can be made possible and that he can do the very thing that he wants to do. And Tamar even says, don't do this. It's wicked. If you ask our father David, I'm sure he'll let me marry you and you can have me lawfully. But the text says, and it depends on what translation you have, that he lay with her, he forced her, he sexually assaulted her, he raped her, really is what he did. And then you read in 1 Samuel 13 that when Amnon had finally fulfilled this desire that he had, and he did with Tamar what he wanted to do, and he sexually gratified himself, it says that he completely turned on her. And the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And it suddenly became a despicable thing to him. And he cast her out of his presence. He was a sorry person, no doubt. But he serves as the very apt illustration, as does Judas, that sometimes the very thing that we want, the very thing that we are enamored by, the very thing that we're almost willing to sell our soul for, once we get our hands on it, it turns to ashes and we hate it. And it's because we believe the lie of the devil. We've been deceived by him. We've been fooled by him. We've been duped by him. And he sits back and he laughs at the misery that we have only compounded in our lives by doing what we have done. It's a very sad, sad truth indeed about sin. Sad truth number 3 about sin. And as you think about Judas, we see it is not always true that what a man becomes, it is not always true that what a man becomes depends on his surroundings. It is not always true that what a man becomes depends on his surroundings. Now, as a general rule, that is true. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 tells us that evil companions corrupt good morals or good habits. And as a general rule, that is a tremendous truth, that if we hang around bad people, we become a bad person. You lay down with the dogs, you get up with fleas. It is a general truth that when we are surrounded by evil people and evil circumstances, that rubs off on us in a very negative degree. On the other side of that, if we put ourselves in good situations with godly people and faithful people, that will rub off on us too. And so there is a general truth there, whether you think about it from the positive side or the negative side, that we generally become what our surroundings are like. But it's not always true. It's not an absolute truth. Because you see, Judas, for 3+ years, walked daily with Jesus. He was surrounded by the teachings of Jesus on numerous occasions. He was surrounded by his fellow disciples, and particularly those who were apostles, men and women who were wanting to serve God to the best degree that they could. Now, none of them were perfect, but they were trying to follow God as faithfully as they could. But then there's Jesus right in the midst of all of that. And Judas is hearing Jesus every time he taught, practically. And Judas was hearing the words of Christ and all the great things that Christ was trying to encourage his followers to become and to be and how to live. And you would have thought that if a man could have risen to the top of spirituality, it would be a man who walked daily with Jesus. But it isn't an absolute truth, is it? You see, what a man, and this is a sad truth, an ironic truth about sin, that it is not always true that what a man becomes depends on his surroundings. Think about, and Judas is a very stunning example of the negative side of this. Think about Demas. 2 Timothy chapter 4. The Apostle Paul says, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. Demas, a man who is mentioned a couple of other times in the writings of Paul and the ministry of Paul. Demas, a man who was influenced by a great and godly man like Paul and other great and godly men that we know lived during that time frame of the early days of the establishment of the church. And yet what happened to this man? He fell away. You would have thought that this man would have been so close to Paul, so close to God, so close to these spiritual teachings that it would have practically been impossible for him to fall away. But Demas, just like Judas, fell away. But you know, it works the other way too. Let me give you at least 3 positive examples that it is not always true that what a man becomes depends on his surroundings. Because while we've been talking about Judas and Demas, who are surrounded by godliness and holiness, and yet they became corrupt and sinful and lost their souls because of that, you know what? There are also some people that we read about in the Bible who are surrounded by wickedness and evil and sin, and they rose above those circumstances. Probably one of the first people you think about in Genesis chapter 6 and following is Noah and his family. Noah lived in a world that says was every thought and the intent of the heart was only evil continually, that it was full of violence and wickedness. And yet, in the midst of all of that surrounded Noah, in the midst of all of that evil, all of that violence, all of those thoughts and intents of the hearts of men that was so anti-godly, Noah rose above. I'm not saying he was perfect. I'm not saying that even he was sinless. But even though Noah was in an environment, everywhere he turned, that was so full of sin, that did not determine the kind of man that Noah became. A little later on in the book of Genesis, will you think of Joseph, who was sold into slavery down in the land of Egypt. And the land of Egypt and the residents of Egypt were known tremendously for their idolatry, for their paganism, for their wickedness. And then he finds himself ending up in a house where the lady of the house, Potiphar's wife, is enticing him, and the text says, on a daily basis, to engage in illicit sexual activity with him. He's away from his family. He's away from anybody that he might be ashamed to be in front of if they were to find this out or to know this. Joseph could have gotten away with anything. Joseph could have become one of them. Joseph could have engaged in this activity with Potiphar's wife and no telling how many other women as well. Joseph could have become an idolater. Joseph could have become a pagan. He could have been involved in all that sinful activity that he was surrounded by. But it's not always true that a man's surroundings determine what he's going to be. Because Joseph rose above where he was. And he continued to live for God. And he continued to live a spiritual life. He continued to live a godly life. What about Daniel? A young man, another young man like Joseph, who was taken into captivity by a people who were from one end to the other filled with paganism and immorality and idolatry. And Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were put into those situations, even in positions of leadership, where it would almost be expected that they would indulge in the idolatry, that they would be involved in the idolatry, that they would pay homage to the God of the Babylonians, the land in which they now live, the land in which that government was giving them privileges and exclusive perks just because they lived there. They could have done it. They could have lived like that. Who would have thought anything about it? Who would have cared? Who would have said they were unfaithful to the God of Israel? Because nobody there even cared who the God of Israel was. But they were determined and resolute. Our surroundings and our environment will not change our heart, will not change our mind. And so it is not always true that our surroundings determine what kind of person we're going to be. And that works both ways. It can be positive and it can be negative. But particularly as we think about Judas, and we see how that it is not always true that what a man becomes is determined by his surroundings. Number 4, this is the final one that we're going to look at tonight. Lord willing, next Sunday night we'll look at 3 more sad truths about sin based on Judas. But number 4 tonight, and this kind of builds on number 3, it is possible, we see this very clearly from the life of Judas, it is possible to be highly involved in service to Jesus, but not have Him in the heart. It is possible to be involved on a consistent, regular basis in the work of the Lord, but not have Him in the heart. There is only an outward affection. There is only a going through the motions, because the heart really isn't there. the heart really has not been convinced that Jesus is Lord. And because the heart is not convinced that Jesus is Lord, then eventually my selfish desires, eventually my own sins, my own desires are going to take the place of what ought to be faithfulness and loyalty to the Lord. But if my heart, Jesus told a parable, Matthew chapter 8, parable of the sower, and he talked about 4 kinds of soils, and really what he's talking about there is 4 kinds of hearts, and the kind of receptivity of man's heart to the gospel. And of one heart, it says, of one soil, it says that it receives the seed grows, but what happens? The cares of this world and the riches and the pleasures of life choke it out. That's a crowded heart. That's a heart that has room for something other than Jesus. And eventually, those weeds that we put in our heart of sin will grow to the extent they choke out anything good and holy and spiritual. And we have to see that the danger for ourselves is not to fall into that kind of mindset, not to have that kind of heart. We're not just here to go through the motions. We're not just here to be here for the sake of being here. We are here because of conviction. We are here because of belief. We are here because of our faith. Now I know that none of us are perfect, but we've got to have some conviction. We've got to have some faith. We've got to have some determination about our service to the Lord. Because we learned from Judas, you can be right in the thick with Jesus. You can be in step with Him almost every day. You can hear His lessons on a regular basis. But if your heart is not where it needs to be, if your heart is not right with God, if your heart is not convinced, if your mind is not convicted, you're going to lose your soul. And the devil will deceive us into thinking because we're busy. I'm following Jesus every day. I'm busy in the kingdom. I'm doing this, or I'm always there when the church doors are open, or I do this, or I do that. I brought a food bag for the pantry. I did these kind of things. But where's your heart? I mean, let's be serious here. Anybody can go to take that list from the pantry and buy groceries and bring it. An atheist could do that, okay? Where is my heart? Am I convinced that I am doing what I am doing because I am sold out for Jesus? I am not doing it just to go through the motions. I'm not doing it just because I have to. I'm doing it because it is my conviction. It is my heart. It is my passion. It is the core of my faith. It is why I do what I do. It's the explanation. It is the essence of my life. That's a very different disposition of heart and mind that Jesus wants us to arrive. Now, as we've made these 4 sad truths and applications based on the life of Judas and his sin, there are 3 more that we want to come together next Sunday night, Lord willing, and also look at. But let's stop right here and let's think about something as we kind of wrap up tonight's study. And I want to think about sins being forgiven. And particularly we think about Judas, because he is sort of the subject of our study last Sunday night, tonight, and next Sunday night. But we think about Judas, and we know that the Bible teaches that for sins to be forgiven, they must be confessed. And when we look at Matthew chapter 27, verse 3 and following, we find Judas confessing his sins. But look at the text, Matthew 27, verse 3. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. He confessed his wrongdoing. But I want you to notice and look at who he went to and who he confessed it to. People who had no pity. People who had no heart. And while, on one hand, it is a little bit of a struggle to completely wrap your mind around what Judas did, when I read these words right here, and I read the response of the chief priest to Judas, when he comes to them in the distress and the despair that he obviously comes to them in, and he says, I have sinned, verse 4, what is that to us? You see to it. My heart hurts for Judas when he heard that. I feel for him, for the pain that he was putting himself through, only to be compounded and spit in his face when he was trying to do something to make it right. And he went to people with his sin who were even more hardened in their sin than he was. And they mocked him. They basically ridiculed him. And no doubt, this drove him further and further into despair and the feeling of hopelessness that he had already. This only served to compound that and multiply it in his heart and mind. And although I do not understand every motivation that Judas had for doing what he did, both in betraying the Lord and then in taking his own life, perhaps, when these men who were supposed to be the spiritual giants, who were supposed to be the priests, who were supposed to be the godly people of Judas' day, perhaps when they cold-heartedly mocked him, perhaps that's when Judas realized, there's nothing I can do but take my own life. What if he had gone to someone with just an ounce of compassion? What if he had gone to someone who cared? What if he had gone to someone who still had love in their heart rather than coldness and hardness and wickedness? How different would this story have ended if Judas had been able to go to the Lord and say, I have sinned because I betrayed you and your innocent blood. You see, when you come to face with your sins, and when I come face to face with my sins, let's go and take them to the one who cares. Not the one who will mock us, not the one who will ridicule us, not the one who is cold and calloused, but to the one who is full of love and mercy and grace. And with his love, will save us. Judas, sadly, never found that. Thank God you and I can. And so if you need to find the one who loves you, the one who can save you, the one who will forgive you, we encourage you, would you come tonight as we stand and we sing?